will be times this year where you will be loading and unloading kilns in the kiln room. So I want to go over with you some basics of kilns and firing. First of all, we have digital scut kilns, and they are 3 different sizes. And depending upon the loads going into the kilns, we use various kiln sizes for all different firing temperatures. You will find this chart next to the storage room. This is behind the large electric kiln in the kiln room. This is our kiln firing chart, and this also kind of identifies and also describes the firing temperatures. For 06, we bisque. 05 is our low fire. Cone 6, even though it is technically a mid-range firing temperature, we often refer to it as high fire because it is the highest that our electric kilns go. Our kilns are capable of firing higher, all the way to cone 9. However, we stop at 6 for the longevity of our kilns. When you hear the phrase kiln furniture, this is what I'm referring to. You can see that there are kiln shelves of various sizes on this kiln shelf cart, as well as the stilts, which separate the layers within the kiln. When you look inside the kiln, you will notice that I often leave the bottom shelves in the kiln. There's no point in removing them unless you need to kiln wash a shelf. So each kiln has carefully designed shelves that fit just perfectly into the kiln. So as you're loading and unloading, always leave that bottom shelf in place unless you need to kiln wash the shelf. So what is kiln wash? Kiln wash is a material that protects the shelf from glaze that may run down the side of the form. You do not want your form to fuse to the bottom of a shelf. So the kiln wash allows it to release if there is some glaze running down the sides. So when I look inside here, and I'm deciding whether or not I want to kiln wash before a glaze firing, I'm going to be looking for some bald spots in the kiln shelf. Right here is an area that will need washed for the protection of the shelf. You want to make sure to check for this before any glaze firing, whether it be low fire or high fire. You don't need to worry so much about it before a bisque firing. I often get the question, what are these used for? These are individual stilts for pots. We rarely use these. There's a lot of problems with using these. They often end up fusing into either the glazed surface or sinking into the clay body itself. We never use these in our cone 6 kiln because at cone 6, we're firing our clay body at what we call complete maturity. And so these little wires will actually sink into the clay and be very hard to release or pry off. Sometimes, but rarely, I use these to stilt some low fire work. Please do not use these stilts without my permission. You should be wiping and removing glaze from the base of all of your pots before you place them back on the shelves. The carts that you're going to be pulling from are positioned right over here in the kiln room. We have our high fire glazeware, our low fire glazeware, and then we have our greenware graded only. You want to make sure that you're only loading absolutely dry work. You can see that I have some damp work towards the back and some drier clay buttons, magnets, etc. that are ready to load. This is our kiln wash bin. Kiln wash is what we apply to the surface of the shelves to protect them from glaze that may run in the kiln. When you open up this container, you will see that there is a whisk already in the wash, ready to go. You want to take the time to thoroughly mix this. It should be a thick milkshake in consistency. Then, once you have this thoroughly mixed, you're then going to take one of the brushes that's sitting back here on the shelves and cover any little bald spots that you see on the surface of the shelf. So I'm not yet thoroughly mixed. You can still see some water on the surface. So really go deep with that whisk and pull the wash up. If the wash hasn't been used for a little while, it takes a little bit longer to mix, but it is very important that it is thick enough for the shelf. So now, often our wash brushes are left very encrusted with kiln wash. We don't wash them after every single use. So you just want to break off the dry wash and it'll make the brush usable. And you're going to be able to then brush this on to only the bald spots on the shelf, only the areas that need patching. I'm going to begin with showing you how to load a greenware kiln. Today I'm going to load greenware into what I refer to as the baby kiln, which is the smallest scut kiln that we have, but greenware can go in any kiln, just as glazeware can go in any kiln. What you want to remember is that greenware, if it is a hollow form, needs to have a little air vent. Because our kilns fire relatively quickly, we want to make sure that the steam can easily escape inside the form. So if you have hollow forms, double check that that person has properly vented the form. You also want to make sure that the work is dry. So if you come over to the graded to be fired shelf, you'll see that I have pieces on here that are a little darker in color and pieces that are a little lighter in color. So this is still damp, this is dry and ready to go. Also, damp work tends to be a little bit cooler to the touch, so if it's a little too cool, just leave it on the shelf to dry a little bit longer. This is a view inside the greenware kiln that I'm loading. If you notice, the stilts that separate the shelves are in a triangular formation. What I mean is there's 1, 2, 3 stilts placed on each shelf. For this particular shelf shape, you want 3 stilts per shelf, and the placement of those stilts is the same for each layer. That will enable for a very stable stack and it will prevent the shelves from warping. Now, when you're loading greenware, you may pile greenware on top of one another, but you don't want to pile it too thick. When I'm loading plates and tiles, I do not pile them more than 2 to 3 pieces thick. Otherwise, you could have breakage because of the weight and also uneven firing in the kiln. So you can see that I left those pinch forms safely stacked, and I also stacked a couple of spoons. It is perfectly fine to stack in the greenware kiln. When you are stacking forms inside of one another, you do want to make sure that there is plenty of wiggle room. It should not be a tight fit, because if there's uneven shrinkage in the firing, you could end up with pots stuck together. So make sure that there's plenty of room with stacking. Inside our large oval kiln, you want to make sure that with those square shelves, you're using 4 stilts, 1 in each corner. Be sure that you're consistent with where you're placing the stilts. But you see that the semicircular shelves have 3 still with that triangle formation. As a reminder, when you are loading glazeware, you want to check first and foremost that your shelves are protected. You want to make sure that you're applying kiln wash to the surface on any little bald spots before loading. You also want to make sure that when you're placing the next layer of shelves onto the stilts, that the kiln wash is facing up. Never turn the kiln wash down. We only kiln wash one side of the shelf. That is because we do not want the dry kiln wash to shower down on the forms below. These are 2 glazeware cups that I have loaded. You notice that there's nice spacing between the forms. They're not crazy wide apart. I'm still smart about my space, but you don't want them touching or they will fuse together. Don't let them touch the stilt either. It will fuse the stilt. So you want to make sure that there's a little bit of space there. Always double check before you put the next shelf on that there's space between each glaze form.